Okay, we're going to talk about migration, about why birds migrate and how they do it. We're going to also talk briefly about where to go and see this. You know, where do you see migration? Where are some of the best places locally to witness migration? And then we're going to learn 17 different species, most of which are warblers, but also a few vireos, a thrush, some swallows, a tanager, grosbeak, and orioles. Many of those are very brightly colored and pretty exciting birds to see in the spring. We'll also listen to what they sound like, because many of these are best found by their song. Okay. Migration. So I always find this fascinating that the ancient Greeks, this is mainly an idea from Aristotle, thought that things like swallows and birds that migrated didn't in fact migrate. They didn't know what that was back then, but they thought they just hibernated through the winter. And after Aristotle, folks thought that swallows would go under the mud in the ponds that they used to catch flies from, and then spend the winter underneath the mud until spring, where they would emerge back out into the pond. Of course, now we know that they actually go some distance. Some species go a long distance. So why do birds migrate? Any ideas?
Lack of food?
Yeah, food is a big part because, you know, if you've spent the winter up here, then you'll know that there's not very much going on. From a bird's perspective, there are very few insects in the winter. So many of the species that rely on insects have a really tough time. So they just wouldn't survive through the winter up here. What else?
To reproduce?
Yeah, and in fact, for many species, it's safer to reproduce up here than it is where they would normally come from. So we think of these birds that migrate up to New England, up to North America. You know, they spend the winter in Central or South America, and many of them in tropical rainforest. And that's a very dangerous place to breed. There are a lot more predators in the rainforest than there are up here, principally snakes, which eat eggs. So many of the species that would ordinarily breed in the rainforest do a better job. They can raise more young by migrating out of that up into North America. Anything else?
Weather conditions.
Weather conditions. Kind of. There's. Can you expand on that?
When they can't get a warm spot in the bush, or
yeah,
snow or
in the
whatever.
winter. Yeah, certainly in the winter, the cold is a problem. So the lack of food and the lack of warmth. So yes, they would migrate back into Central America. But I'm just interested in why they don't spend their whole life in Central America, because it's quite exhausting to migrate this far north. There are a lot of risks involved in that. But one thing that birds have, many of these migrating species breed up in northern Canada or Alaska. And what is different about Alaska than breeding in Central America?
The sun.
The sun. Well done, Carolyn. The sun. So if you're breeding up in Alaska, you can have 24 hours of light. You can feed around the clock, compared to just 12 hours, that fixed 12 hours at the equator. So you can feed twice as long as birds that are breeding in tropical rainforests in Central America, and that's important because you need food to bring up young birds. So they can raise chicks faster. Often they'll do one or two. They'll sometimes do two broods, so they'll breed twice. They can produce a lot more young up in very, very far north, where there's a lot of food and they can feed all around the clock. So birds migrate because of the seasonally abundant food supplies. Think about Alaska in the summer. There's a lot of insects, a lot of mosquitoes. They avoid the high nest predation and parasites in the tropics, mainly snakes and monkeys, which feed on a large number of birds' eggs, and they have these longer days for extended foraging. Obviously, that doesn't work in the winter, so they have to then migrate back down out of there in the winter. But there are obviously costs with this. It's very energetic, flying huge distances, and there's a danger of getting lost or eaten along the way. So this is a map that just shows you migration through the year. Each of these dots represents one individual species, and for each species, that dot is sort of like the center point of the geographic sort of range of that species. So this is like 30 or 40 different species, and you can see the vast majority of them Some of them are going to winter all the way down in the tip of South America. The rest of them, there's a large number that are wintering. This is when they're wintering now in Central America, spread out all the way through South America as well. And you can see them moving north. This is February. They move north fairly early in the year. By April, May, they're all the way through the US. And by June, many of those are in Alaska or Arctic Canada. And they're not there for very long. They're sort of turning around in July as the weather conditions up there start to deteriorate. They don't have a very long summer in the Arctic. So this is kind of fascinating. This just sort of shows you how each of these species is moving up and down. And many of them are going long distances. You can see that some of these balls are traveling, half a equator. They're going all the way from South America up to North America. Some of those species take different directions when they go north and south. So birds like this blackpoll warbler, they'll migrate from northern South America up into Canada and Alaska. And many of them will come up along the Mississippi River, which acts as a sort of funnel for birds. But in the fall, when you've got better winds coming from the east, they'll migrate out over the Atlantic Ocean, and those winds push the birds forward and down back into South America. So many of these species will do this sort of loop migration, where they'll take different routes in the spring and in the fall. So they're learning two different routes. These are very, very long distances these birds are traveling. And they're not just repeating the route that they took in the spring, they're taking a new route in the fall. Most songbirds migrate at night. And this is really important. We don't see a lot of birds migrating because they're doing it when we're asleep or when it's dark. And they do that for a number of reasons. They use the stars to navigate. It's cooler when they're flying at night than during the day. And if you think about a bird that's migrating, it's flying all night, it's flying 12 hours, and it's flapping its wings continuously, you get pretty hot doing that. So having the cool nights really helps those birds from overheating. And hawks don't fly at night, so there's less chance of them being eaten by hawks if they migrate at night. If you're out during spring migration and you don't have much traffic around you, you can listen and you can hear birds flying over your house. Some will make these very tiny, high-pitched calls, and they're using those calls to stay in contact with the rest of the flock. These are large numbers of birds migrating together, and they're sort of issuing these very high-pitched, thin calls so that they can keep the flock together. They don't get lost. And you can hear that. If you're out at night during migration, you can hear birds passing overhead. Hawks migrate themselves, but they migrate during the day because they need the heat of thermals, which keeps those birds aloft. They can't migrate over water. They migrate over land, which produces this thermal rising of hot air, often over mountains or mountain ridges. But they don't eat. They can't eat the birds that are migrating because they migrate during the night. If you remember back to that slide I showed where all the balls are moving up and down through Central, South, and North America, it takes a long time for birds to migrate, and they'll do that over several nights. They leave as soon as the sun sets. They'll head in the right direction, and then as the sun comes up, they'll land, and they'll be exhausted at that point, and they will need to feed because they've been flying all night. And they'll stay in that place the whole day. And if the weather is favorable that evening, if they have good tailwinds, it's not raining, they have good visibility, they'll leave that evening and continue on their journey. If the weather is bad, they might stay there several days. So when you're watching migrants, you might go to a place, you might go to woodland the next day and there's nothing. You may have had a lot of birds the previous day, you go there the next day and there's nothing, and that's because all those birds have left. There were very good conditions for the birds to leave. This is an interesting migrant. This is the Arctic tern. Terns are like little gulls. They're very pointy wings, very delicate birds, really beautiful. They migrate with most of the land birds, but this bird sees more light than any other creature on the planet, and that's because it's called the Arctic tern for a reason. They breed in the Arctic, all around the circumpolar, all around the Arctic, and then at the end of the breeding season, they migrate and spend the winter or the southern hemisphere summer in the Antarctic. So these birds migrate from the Arctic to the Antarctic every year. They do that twice a year, so a 50,000-mile round trip every year. It's a lot of frequent flyer points. Really incredible bird, and it sees the most light because if you think about it, it's spending the summer up in the Arctic where it doesn't get dark. It's got 24 hours of sunlight, and then when it's the winter in the northern hemisphere, it's the summer in the southern hemisphere. So when they overwinter in the south, they're actually over summering, and then they get 24 hours of light down there. So really incredible migration. This is one of the longest migrants. This is the bar-tailed godwit. This is the bird that overwinters in New Zealand, and in the spring they move through Australia, Japan, Kamchatka in the Russian Far East, and they breed in Alaska. And in the fall, they depart Alaska and they fly non-stop over the Pacific Ocean, all the way from Alaska down to New Zealand. Wow. And that's about a 7,000-mile non-stop trip. And it takes about 8.5 days to fly. They're going about 35 miles an hour. They can't eat, they can't drink for those 8.5 days. While they've been in Alaska, they've been building up their fat deposits. They build up large amounts of fat, and they burn that fat as they're flying. And actually that fat releases enough water that they don't dehydrate. They also need to sleep. And like most birds, they sleep by shutting down half of their brain. So as these birds are flying, they shut down one half of their brain and turn that off and rest it. And then they'll switch around and they'll shut the other one off. And they'll do that as they're flying. I think it's amazing that they can fly so far, and they know where they're going. They don't overshoot. They don't go too far to the east and miss New Zealand and keep flying. They all land in New Zealand. And the even more incredible part is that these birds are breed in Alaska. So the parents lay their eggs in Alaska. And as soon as the young hatch, the parents go to New Zealand. They leave. The young are left on their own to fend for themselves. They're pretty hardy birds. They don't need to be fed in the nest. As soon as they come out of the shell, they can walk around and feed. So they don't need parental care. So all the adults leave. And then you've got all these young birds that are in Alaska. And they fly to New Zealand on their own without ever having done it before. They know that they have to fly. Somehow in their brain, they know they have to fly for 8.5 days in this direction. And eventually they'll come to where they're supposed to go. And that's just incredible that they have that innate knowledge and faith in doing something so extraordinary. If they land on the water, they die. They can't land on the surface of the sea.
Neil, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Is there a group of head birds, or is there a leader to guide them, or do the birds take turns leading and deciding what to do?
That's a great question. I don't think they're like geese. Geese do all of those things that you described, where they have these large sort of V-shaped formations and they switch around as to who's the leader. Some of these birds will go on their own, and they've never done it before. Some of them will leave at the same time because the conditions are favorable, so they'll try and leave at the same time because that's a good time to go. So a lot of them will go at the same time. But they're not. They are sort of keeping in contact with each other, but that doesn't mean that individual birds aren't successful on their own because they do it on their own. They don't need a large flock, but because they all want to sort of leave around the same time, and if they want to time it to the best conditions, that you inevitably get a large number leaving and flying sort of together. But they can do it on their own. Okay, bar-tailed godwit. This is an indigo bunting, and these are birds that we get only in the summer. In the winter, there are no indigo buntings in the country at all. And this graphic just shows you observations of indigo buntings throughout the year. So this is February, March, April, April now. And you can see these first observations are turning up on the Gulf Coast. So these birds are flying from the Yucatan Peninsula. They're flying over the Gulf and they're hitting the coast in Texas and Louisiana. Okay, and they're migrating further north. And you can see there's a lot of them sort of aligned with the Mississippi River. And many birds will use river courses like the Connecticut River here as a really easy visual landmark to follow. In this case, these birds are using the Mississippi River. So keep going. June, July, and this is pretty much the breeding range of indigo buntings. We get them in Massachusetts, not huge numbers of them, but it's a bird that's present in East and North America. None really in southern Florida, and none in those sort of coastal areas of the Gulf where they were first seen, where they first land after that long journey over the Gulf. And then at the end of the fall, they'll start heading back in the other direction. So now they're going to start moving south. Again, congregating, building up in numbers along the Gulf Coast, waiting for the right conditions to fly over. And by November, they've all disappeared. They've all left the country. So huge numbers of birds. and sort of interesting strategy of they're using water courses, and they're all flying over the Gulf to get where they're going. Some species will go around, but almost all of them, including our hummingbirds fly non-stop over the Gulf of Mexico, and that takes them about a day and a half. And like the bar-tailed godwit, if they land on the water, they die. They cannot land on the sea. So those birds, those tiny little hummingbirds that we see in the summer, they're all getting here by doing the same route. They're flying over the Gulf of Mexico and then all the way up through the country. I saw a chart the other day showing that the most northerly hummingbirds at the moment are in about Delaware. So they're still a few weeks away from getting here, but they're coming. Okay, so when is migration? Most of the migration is between April and June. And this is just showing you on the right-hand side a chart of a bunch of different species. You don't have to know which ones they are, but you can see most of that is happening in the month of May. There are some species that start appearing in April, and some that linger into June. But the majority of migration is sort of the end, maybe the last week of April through May. That's the bulk of it. But you will start seeing that even from now. There'll be some species that are starting to migrate now. The more northerly the species breeds, the later it will come through. Because if they get there too early, if they got there now, there's no food to eat. It's frozen. There are no insects. So those ones will come through at the very end. The ones that breed in Arctic Canada will be the last ones that pass through Massachusetts. Some of them aren't just passing through. Some will stop here and breed. There'll be some of the earlier ones. But the ones that come through at the end will be the ones that migrate further north. During migration, the males are practicing their singing. So if you're out in the morning and you hear migrants, many of the males will be singing. They're practicing their songs. Generally, females don't sing. Although a few species like northern cardinals, which aren't migrants, they're here all year round, they will sing. Okay, and where can you go to see migration? Well, anywhere. Your yard is a good start. If you have things like oak trees in your yard, you'll probably have some warblers that will be feeding on insects attracted to the blossoms in the spring. And locally, Horn Pond is one of the best places around Winchester. That's a great place to see birds. Middlesex Fells is another great location. Arlington Reservoir is also a good place to see songbirds. And slightly further afield, Mount Auburn Cemetery is one of the best places in the Northeast to see warblers during spring migration. And Plum Island is a great place to see not only land birds, but some of the ducks and waterfowl that are also migrating at this time of year.
Can you say why Mount Auburn Cemetery is so popular?
Oh, yes, I'd be happy to. Mount Auburn Cemetery is really popular because of an effect called the Central Park effect. And that's named after Central Park in New York. And if you think about what New York looks like from a bird's perspective, it's this huge area of concrete with this small bit of greenery in the middle. Okay, so if you think back to what I said about how birds migrate, they're feeding throughout the day. When the sun sets, that's when they leave. They fly off heading north, and they'll fly all night, assuming that they don't hit rain or any bad weather. They'll fly all night. And then as soon as the sun comes up, there's a risk then that they'll get attacked by hawks. So they will land. They're exhausted. They've been flying all night. They're hot. They're very hungry, and they need to feed. And that instinct of feeding is so strong that if you're a bird over New York and you see all of this concrete, that will freak you out because there's nowhere to eat. It's just got this like massive area of concrete. But this small sort of haven, this small oasis of greenery, which is Central Park, birds will head for that. Normally, birds would just land on the bit of forest below them, but because we've changed the landscape so much, that's not possible. If you think about all these birds over Greater Manhattan, effectively all of those over a very large airspace will be sort of sucked into or congregate in this very small park, because that will give them the food to recover from last night's flight and prepare them for the next hop they have to do that evening. Mount Auburn Cemetery is a similar effect. You think about Boston, there's a lot of non-green areas throughout Boston, but places like Boston Common and Mount Auburn Cemetery especially as these sort of beacons for tired migrants that need to feed.
They drawn to a tree canopy in particular? Or
yes, many of these will be feeding on insects, and those insects are feeding on, especially if you see in the spring when things like oak trees are sort of, they're leafing out and they've got this sort of blossom, that's attracting a lot of insects, and it's that the birds are feeding on. Almost all of these are insect eaters.
Thank you.
We have a question from Leslie Ham. When will the hummingbirds come to Western Massachusetts?
Oh, probably last week of April, and then like the first couple of weeks of May is probably when you'll get your first one.
We have a question from Diane. She's in Georgia at the moment, and there are lots of cardinals, blue jays, and woodpeckers. Do these migrate as well?
None of those do. So all of those species are resident. So cardinals, they're year round. All the woodpecker species are resident. Some of them might disperse a bit in the winter. They might, move around a few miles to look for better food sources, but they're not doing any of these long distance migrations that we're talking about tonight. But some things will, things like robins, robins will migrate. We have robins year round in Massachusetts, but they're not the same robins. So the robins that breed here in the summer, they move further south in the winter. They might move down to Georgia or somewhere along the mid-Atlantic coast. And then we get the ones that were breeding in Newfoundland and Canada that will winter with us. So even though we have robins year round, we've got these two populations that are sort of moving. And because we're in the middle of that, we don't see a gap. So as our breeding birds move south, they're replaced gradually by ones from the north. So it feels like we always have robins year round, but they're not the same robins. So that's a migratory species, but because we're in both the summer and the winter range, we see them year round. Okay, Horn Pond, if you haven't been to Horn Pond, this is what it looks like from a bird's eye perspective. It's a great place there's a lot of woodland canopy here for feeding migrants. It's a great location to see birds. There's also some water for some of the water birds as well. When I was putting this photo, I noticed another photo which intrigued me, which was this. This is what Horn Pond looked like in 1906, when I guess like a lot of these ponds in Massachusetts that's where a lot of the world got their ice from ice harvesting. Certainly a lot of the ponds in Cambridge, these were big areas for domestic and international shipping of ice. So hard to imagine that now, but yes. Anyway, hopefully during migration it doesn't look like this for all of our benefits. Okay, so we're going to learn some species. We're going to look at eastern phoebe as a flycatcher. There are two species of vireos: hermit thrush, Baltimore oriole, scarlet tanager, rose-breasted grosbeak, both really stunning birds. Two species of swallow. So those are the only non-songbirds. Everything else is a songbird. Swallows we'll find over water or over open land, and then a few species of warbler. Okay. And I'm going to show you some sonograms as well, because we're going to listen to some of these species. And this is sort of a representation of a sonogram on the right. As you can see, it moves from left to right. So this is time along the bottom, and then frequency. That's how high pitched the sound is. And it really is the same as a musical staff. If you go up, then it's higher pitched. If you go down, it's lower pitched. And then the longer this sound, the longer this bar, the longer that sound is. So this is a short sound. This is a long sound. So this is, anyone know what this piece of music is?
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Good job. So, da, 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 da. Well, my poor rendition, but you get the idea. That much better. Thank you. Good. Okay, so eastern phoebe, this is one of the first migrants to come back, and they're already here. So this is a bird that has already returned to Massachusetts. It's the only member of the flycatcher we're going to look at tonight. Flycatchers are an interesting group of birds. There are many species that eat flies, but there's a whole family called flycatchers. And these birds come from South America. They evolved in South America. And they're unique, almost unique among birds in not learning their song. So most birds have to learn their song from their parents. These birds don't. It's innate. They know it inside their head. As soon as they're born, they know how to sing. If you take something like a robin chick and you put a robin chick in a cardinal nest, that chick will learn to sing like a cardinal. Okay, it's learning from its parent. If it has the wrong parent, it learns the wrong song. These guys, they don't care. You could put one of these in a robin nest, in a cardinal nest, in a blue jay nest. They're not confused. They know that they're a phoebe. They know how to sing a phoebe song. They don't get kids. It's innate. Okay, kind of like those Bartel godwits, which are flying all the way to New Zealand. They just know how to do that. These birds know how to sing. They don't have to learn it. It's a fairly nondescript bird, kind of pale white, sort of creamy underneath, brown, sort of a dark brown cap, and then brown body and brown tail. But they do one thing that's very distinctive, and you can see this even if these birds are silhouetted and you can't see any of the color, is that they'll frequently dip their tail like that. They flip their tail up and down. And they have a very distinctive song, which sounds like this. And they're sort of alternating between Phoebity and Phoebe. So there's Phoebe, but that's where it gets its name. It gets the name from Phoebe. So that's this sort of Phoebe, this very kind of hoarse. Let me do that one more time. It'll do the Phoebity first of all, and then the second one it does, the Phoebe, that's the one that's I think is very distinctive. Phoebe. Phoebe. So listen out for Phoebes because they're saying their name. So it's an easy bird to identify because it's helping you. It's telling you who it is. So that's the Phoebe. Anyone seen eastern Phoebes yet or seen them in previous years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some of you are nodding. Yeah, beautiful bird. Like most flycatchers, they have very thin bills. You see these bills are very fine. They're quite long. Many birds that eat insects have these very delicate bills. They don't need very much strength to crush an insect. Compare that to something like a northern cardinal, which is crushing seeds with its bill. You know, the seed eaters, like sparrows, cardinals, goldfinches, have much bigger mandibles, really kind of heavy bills. If you see a bird like this with a very thin, sort of long bill, it's probably eating insects. Much more delicate. Doesn't need a heavy bill, and as a bird, you're trying to save as much weight as you possibly can. So you don't want to have a bill that's too heavy or too big if you don't need it or if you're not using it. Okay, that's the eastern Phoebe.
We have one question. Aren't they fairly tiny?
Are they fairly tiny?
Yeah.
Well, yes, in comparison to a albatross, yes, they're very tiny. They're probably about 4 or 5 inches, maybe 5 or 6 inches, maybe about 5 inches. So about like that. They're bigger than a black-capped chickadee, if that puts it into context, and smaller than a northern cardinal. So between a chickadee and a cardinal, maybe like a sort of goldfinch size. So that kind of size. So yes, they're pretty small. And again, that behavior of sort of dipping its tail, they frequently do that, and it's very diagnostic for this bird. They'll often sit on these exposed perches because they're going to go out and they're fly catching. They're looking for flies. They'll dart out, catch a fly in midair, and then come back often to the same perch. So they have these sort of sallying flights where they'll go out and catch insects. And they will nest they nest in cavities, but they'll find holes anywhere that they can nest in your yard. They're very adept at sort of turning a lot of sort of our structures into potential nesting habitats. Okay, red-eyed vireo. This one is a lot harder to spot. These birds are often in the canopy. They're hard to see, and these are fairly lethargic. I always think of vireos as fairly slow-moving, lethargic birds, about the size of a sparrow. Vireos have hooked bills, although kind of like a hawk, but it's very hard to see. I mean, they have a slight hook coming over the top. Unless you get a good view, it's hard to see that. This is called the red-eyed vireo for a good reason. It has a bright red eye, has a grey cap, white over the eye, and a sort of greenish olive back. Vireos have distinctive songs, and you will certainly hear this bird before you see it. Okay, and these are birds that I think can drive you mad because they can sing incessantly without stopping for hours and hours and hours, and it's like they're having a conversation with themselves. So listen to this. So a very slow conversation, and often it's kind of written out as, here I am in the tree. Look up here at the top. And it just goes on. It can do this for hours. It just never gets bored. And very common bird in the tree canopy, but probably one that you would never see if you didn't hear it calling and didn't pay attention to it. Okay, so probably most of us here have probably never seen a red-eyed vireo, or maybe have never even heard of one. And there's a good reason, because they don't really advertise themselves except with their call. And if you know their song and then look up and try and spot it in the canopy, then you may have never seen one. I guess that when I talk about canopy, for these birds, that's often the very top of the trees. And I should point out at this point that spring bird watching can be a dangerous activity. You often end up with, after a morning of birding, something called warbler neck, because your neck has been doing this all morning, looking for these birds at the very top of the trees. And after a morning of that, you can have your neck can really ache. So we call that warbler neck. Anyway, you might get warbler neck from this red-eyed vireo, but a beautiful bird and very confident singer. But very distinctive when you see it. Very distinctive, that red eye. And then that line above the eye, and there's a bit of a dark line that goes through the eye as well. And a hooked bill. If you get a good view, you might see that hooked bill, which is something that's true of all vireos. This is another vireo called the warbling vireo. And if you go somewhere like Horn Pond, this will be one of the most common birds that you will hear. They're very numerous. And this bird has the, there's almost no way to describe this bird because it has almost no field marks. It's brown, sort of olive brown, and it has a sort of slight eyebrow, and that's about it. There's really no other color on it, nothing else that distinguishes it. Like the red-eyed vireo, the bill is slightly hooked, but it's kind of hard to see. This is what they sound like. They have a very different song from the red-eyed vireo. They have this sort of rapid, husky warble, which, if you count the individual notes, is about 13 notes. But they do one thing that's very distinctive, which is at the end, they have this very emphatic ending. So let's listen to that. So doodle-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. You see how it sort of went up at the end and it got a bit louder. One more time. Okay, and like the red-eyed vireo, this is a bird that you're not likely to see unless you hear it first of all. So I'm putting these two birds in because these are going to be ones that if you know what to listen for, then you have a good chance of seeing these birds because they are very common, especially warbling vireos are very common. But they're not likely to be sort of flying around at low level in front of you. These are birds you have to put some effort into looking for them in the canopy. But if you know their song, you'll be able to find many of them. It's not a difficult to find bird. But you need to know their song. So warbling vireo and red-eyed vireo. Okay, let's move on to thrushes. This is the hermit thrush, and this is a member of a family called the thrush family. Anyone know what our most common member of the thrush family is?
Robin.
Yes, good job. American robin is a member of the thrush family. These birds, hermit thrushes, are smaller than robins, and they're really beautiful birds. They have this sort of lovely spotting on the breast, a bit of an eye ring, sort of yellowish eye ring, and then a sort of reddish-brown, bright sort of reddish-brown tail, which they often cock up like that. And it's one of the most beautiful songsters that we have here. Many thrushes have a sort of flute-like song, and this bird has a long introductory whistle, and then some sort of twirling phrases after that. And it'll repeat this, but each time it'll change the frequency. So it'll go up or down, but it's the same structure. So that long doo diddly 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 doo diddly 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 doo diddly diddly diddly. A much higher pitch for that one. So really beautiful song. And these birds are easier to see. These birds are often on the ground. Okay, you won't get warbler neck from this bird. These are often on the ground or very low to the ground in bushes and shrubs. This is the hermit thrush, and these will be arriving next month. Often in mid-April, we'll start to see those. You'll see them hopping on the ground, like American robins. They'll feed on worms. So they like sort of lawns, although they're more shy than American robins, and they're considerably smaller as well. But same kind of structure and same kind of behavior. Okay, that's the hermit thrush. Okay, now how many of you have Baltimore orioles in your yard in the summer? Anyone?
Yes,
Yes. And how do you? What are you feeding them?
natural. I don't believe in bird
Oh, okay.
feeders.
Oh, fantastic. You've obviously got some good natural plants.
Yes,
Okay.
I have lots of trees and bushes that I planted. And
Good
so
job.
they come, yeah,
That is the best way of feeding birds, is to
I'm a
plant,
naturalist.
is to plant native vegetation.
Yes,
I did feed, last year I saw my first Baltimore Oriole in my yard, and I put oranges out, which I know is not natural, but I got to see them, which was so exciting.
yeah, and actually this photo here has a picture of an orange. So Baltimore orioles are very partial to oranges, so that's a great way of attracting them. Beautiful birds. If you follow baseball, you'll notice that these are the same colors as the Baltimore Orioles baseball team. Beautiful orange and black. This is the male at the top. The female is more muted. She's sort of more of a yellowy orange with sort of gray on the back. And they make these kind of intricate nests. They have these hanging nests, this sort of sack. And they're often attached to like 3 points. These very, very thin branches at the end, and it supports this structure. And the oriole goes in the top. And it does that so that they avoid predation by things like squirrels, because these are right at the very ends of the tips of the branches, and squirrels were just too heavy to sort of get that far out. They would start falling off if they came that far out. So this protects their nest from those types of predators. This is what they sound like. Quite a pleasant whistling sound. They have very very sharp, pointy bills. It's a very, very sharp point on that bill. You see the female has that as well. And these birds are actually in the same family. These are in the blackbird family, the icterid family. These birds are very closely related to red-winged blackbirds. If you know what red-winged blackbirds are, red-winged blackbirds are often found in sort of swampy wetland areas. You often get large flocks of them. They can be a bit of a menace. I don't think they have a particularly attractive song. They sound like conkery, conkery, kind of like a screeching sort of sound. These are much more lyrical birds, and also much more beautiful. So Baltimore Oriole, and these are birds that we get in the summer. Occasionally 1 or 2 overwinter in the States. Typically in Cape Cod, they might try and survive through the winter, but everything else, the rest of them just leave. They migrate south. And these will be coming back in May. And when they arrive back, they'll be singing. And for a brightly colored bird, they're surprisingly hard to find because they like sort of hiding in the middle of trees. You'll see them flying between trees. You'll hear them singing. And this is another good one to know the song, because if you know the song, you'll know where to look and you know what it is. But for such a brightly colored bird, they can be quite secretive.
We've seen them in the field behind the high school,
Mm-hmm.
the trees along the edge of the field, over towards Washington, towards Main Street.
Okay, and they're there during the.
Hanging down there.
Oh, nice. Do you think they're breeding there? Are they there throughout the summer?
Yeah, there's a nest that we've
Oh.
often seen a nest hanging down from the trees there.
Good. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. So often those nests are hard to find, but in the fall, when all the leaves fall off, suddenly you see all of these oriole nests sort of all over the place. That's a good time to look for them. They don't last. They typically don't last through the winter, and the birds wouldn't reuse those nests. They'd make a new nest. But sometimes you can see these nests long after the birds have gone, as the leaves fall off. But yeah, beautiful bird. So Baltimore Oriole. Okay, another stunner is the rose-breasted grosbeak. And anyone seen rose-breasted grosbeaks? Okay, Donna is nodding her head. Okay, a few others. Really exceptionally beautiful birds, sort of black and white on top. They're called grosbeaks because of this massive bill. These are not insect eaters. These are birds that crush seeds. They have these very large bills, and white underneath with a sort of V of sort of blood red on the breast. The female is very different. Same shape, same size bill. She has a white eyebrow, but she's just brown and white, with a bit of beige, and with some streaking underneath. So she looks very different. And these birds arrive in May. These birds breed in woodlands. They breed in Massachusetts, and they sound a bit like robins. I'm going to play a robin first of all to remind you what robins sound like. Some of you may have robins singing in the mornings already, so you're very familiar with this. This is a robin. Okay, typically sort of 4 or 5 note phrases, and it's a bit sort of, it's a bit hoarse. It's like the bird has sort of something stuck in its throat. It's a bit sort of buzzy. In contrast, the rose-breasted grosbeak sings. They sound a bit like American robins, and they are confused with American robins in their song, but they sing a bit faster, and they're much more clear-toned. They don't have that buzziness of the American robin, and this is what they sound like. So really, really beautiful song, slightly more squeaky, more pure toned than an American robin. I hope you get to see one of these this spring, because this is always one of the birds that I look forward to in the spring. If I see one of these in the spring, I've had a very good day or a very good week. It's such a beautiful bird, and a really nice bird to listen to as well. Okay, rose-breasted grosbeak. They will sing from sort of mid-canopy in trees, but often their song will give them away. So if you track them down from their song, you can find them. Okay, we're still in the realm of stunning birds. This is another stunner. This is the scarlet tanager. And males, bright red with black wings. Females also have black wings, but they have a sort of greenish-yellow body. Fairly large bill. These are sort of omnivores. They eat pretty much anything. They'll eat seeds, they'll eat insects, berries, fruit, so a kind of wide range of different things. They sound also like a robin, but they sound like a robin with a sore throat. This is what they sound like. It's really hard to separate that from the American robin. It probably sounds identical to you. To me, it sounds like a bit more buzzy. But just be aware that if you hear American robins singing, just take your binoculars out or look in that direction, and just make sure it's not a tanager or a rose-breasted grosbeak, because both of those sound like American robins. The grosbeak sounds like it's an American robin that's had singing lessons, and this one sounds like an American robin that's had a sore throat. But otherwise, they're kind of very similar to American robins. Like grosbeaks, these are birds that you'll find up in the trees, sort of mid-canopy, and yeah, really stunning birds. Tanagers. Okay, there are 2 species of swallow. Before we go on to warblers, there are 2 species of swallow to look out for. The barn swallow and the tree swallow. Barn swallows we get over sort of open country, over fields. Any areas with agricultural fields are great for barn swallows. They will be eating flies that are flying out over grasslands. Often you'll find them in maybe 1s or 2s, maybe a small flock, not many. Tree swallows you can find in in full migration, you can find in the millions. You can find certainly in the thousands. If you go to Plum Island, there's probably 10,000 of there in the summer. They form large flocks, often over wetland areas or over water. So Horn Pond would attract these over the water. They're feeding on the insects above the surface of the water. Tree swallows are sort of iridescent blue above and then bright white below. Barn swallows are sort of blue above, but they have red in the face, the forehead and the chin, and then they have a very interesting tail. This distinctive sort of swallow-shaped tail with a very long outer tail feather, and then sort of shorter central tail feathers, and these white dots that go along. It's a very distinctive tail. Nothing else looks like that. If you go places like Plum Island, you'll see these nest boxes that are in the wetland areas, and that's where the tree swallows breed. They breed in those nest boxes. Barn swallows will nest in those types of things, but they for other types of structures, they will nest in barns. That's where they get their name from. Both of those are worth looking out for. So barn swallow and tree swallow. Okay. There are a lot of warblers. If you have a field guide of birds, you'll know that there are a lot of warblers out there. And Massachusetts has recorded 43 different species of warbler. That's almost every single warbler found in North America. We have about 46 of them regularly. And a horn pond, in any year, you can expect to see about 25 of them.
Yeah.
So that's more warblers than are shown on this picture. And for many birders, these are the sort of special birds that people are excited about during migration because they're small and they come in all these different colors. Really stunning birds. And they have some of them have really beautiful songs as well. These are the gems of spring migration, the warblers. We're going to look at a few of them. Some of the more common ones that you can find in places like Fresh Pond. These two are the earliest ones to arrive. So from the first week of April, these birds return to Massachusetts. The pine warbler on the left and the palm warbler on the right. Pine warbler likes pine trees. That's where it gets its name from. They live in pine groves, sort of bright yellow with a few sort of streaks of sort of dark yellow on the side and these bright white wing bars. Otherwise, a fairly nondescript bird. Often high up in the trees. They're hard to see, okay, but usually around pine trees. Palm warblers are the opposite. These birds are often on the ground. And like the eastern phoebe, they will dip their tail regularly. They'll move their tail around, up and down. Very distinctive for palm warblers. They cannot stop moving it. It's like they're always doing that. If you see a bird doing this on the ground, it's chances are it's going to be a palm warbler. They have, they're also yellow underneath, but they have more defined streaking on the breast and the sides of the breast. They also have this kind of chestnut, sort of brown cap. It's very distinctive. And a bit of an eyebrow, a yellow eyebrow above that. Both of these birds sound like each other. They have a sort of buzzy trill. This is what the palm warbler sounds like. And the pine warbler sounds very similar. Those two are very hard to separate. But if you're hearing a sort of trill like that, a brrrr, chances are it's going to be a pine warbler or a palm warbler. Pine warblers are in pine trees, often high up in pine trees, and palm warblers are on the ground, waving their tail around incessantly. Okay, so that's an easy one to identify by its behavior. And this is one of the few warblers that you'll get on the ground. Most of the warblers we're going to see are in the trees, often at the top of the trees. So this is a good one to get good views of because it's low down on the ground.
Neil, is there a purpose to their waving their tail up and down?
That's a good question. So, there must be, since they put an inordinate amount of energy into doing that. There are other birds that do that as well, and some birds that will bob up and down as well as they're walking. And it's thought that that might sort of confuse insects or attract insects. It might sort of scare insects up that are on the ground. So it's probably to do with their feeding, and it probably makes their feeding easier by either scaring more insects up into the air where they can catch them or making them move. It's probably that's the current thought, is that it has some impact on their prey.
That's interesting. It's kind of like the whales with their tails that when they slap the water. That's one of the theories.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. Well, this bird is doing the same thing then. It's slapping the air with its tail to try and improve its feeding success.
Interesting. Thank you.
One other thought on that is also is that it provides some balance as they're walking on uneven surfaces. So these birds are walking on the ground, and it's thought that this sort of bobbing the tail up and down is sort of like this internal gyro that actually makes it easier for the bird to move around without falling over all the sort of the complicated structure of the ground. Okay, so those are palm warblers and pine warblers. The first two species to arrive. These are the first two warblers we get in Massachusetts. Pine warblers, palm warblers, both from the first week of April. Okay. The rest of these are going to be things that arrive towards the end of April and then into May. And one of the most distinctive is this warbler, the black and white warbler, appropriately named since it's black and white. White with all these black streaks on it. This is a male because it has a black bib. The females have a white chin. The males have this black chin. And these behave like a nuthatch. If you know what a nuthatch is, Nuthatches are birds that sort of spiral around trees. They pick out of the bark, and these birds will do the same thing. They will sort of spiral around sort of tree trunks and bark. And no other warbler really does that. It's the only one that does that. They'll glean insects off of the bark. There are many species of warbler, and they're all, the reason they can all live together in the same sort of areas is because they're all sort of targeting slightly different insects. These birds are getting insects off of the bark, which most of the other birds aren't doing. They have a high-pitched squeaky sound, like this. And it sounds a bit like, if you're polishing a bit of glass that sort of, after you've been over polishing it, it starts to squeak a bit. And it's sort of, that's what it always reminds me of that sound. So one more time, this is. So the squeaky glass warbler, the black and white warbler. These are relatively common. So if you went out in spring migration in May, early May, you have a good chance of seeing these birds. And these will often come quite low down. You don't have to look up in the canopy for these birds. But knowing their song, again, will help you locate them. Okay, this is a warbler that doesn't have warbler in its name. It's an American redstart. And the start is the tail, refers to the tail. And the males are really beautiful colors. They're black, sort of jet black with sort of orange or red in the sides of the tail and a flash at the wing, and then sort of in the sort of armpits of the bird. The female is more muted. She has a gray head, and she has yellow rather than orange. And so he's a redstart. Some people call the females lemon starts because they look like this is a lemon color rather than the orange or red of the redstart. So redstarts and lemon starts, but they're both redstarts. Oh, I should point out, so many of the warblers that you can identify males and females. Males and females will look slightly different. Males are usually brighter. And males will arrive first. And they arrive first because the first wave of that species is usually males. The males are desperate to get to the breeding ground and set up and defend a territory. Okay, so that's their job. Often they're trying to get there at the optimum time. So these birds are leaving Central America or South America. They want to get there early enough that all the best territories haven't gone. If they get there too late, there are no places to breed. All the territories have gone. So they want to get there and find a really good territory. If they get there too early, there's no food there because it's still winter. There aren't insects around, and they'll die. So they're sort of trying to find balance that timing of getting there early enough so they can secure and defend a really good territory, but not too early that there's enough food for them to survive. They're sort of timing that. Females don't need to get there early because they're not trying to set up a territory, so they can take their time and wait for more food to arrive before they turn up there. So typically, for each of these species, the first week or so, you'll only be seeing males of that species, and then the females will start appearing because the males are trying to get there first of all, and then you've got this wave of females following. Okay, so don't be surprised if all of the redstarts you're seeing are males. It's because that's the beginning of the migration, and all the males are going through first. At the tail end of redstart migration, all the birds will be females. You'll see this flip towards the end of that migration. These birds often fan their tails. You can see this bird sort of raising its tail here and sort of fanning it out. They'll often do that. They're quite acrobatic with that. And I'm not going to play you the song because this is one of the most varied of all warblers in their songs, and they almost have no distinctive song. So if it's a song you don't recognize as a birder, it's often a redstart. They have a wide range of things that they say, and it's a hard bird to identify by song. I find it a hard bird to identify by song because they just have so many different things that they sing. That's the American redstart. Okay, the northern PARULA or northern PARULA is the smallest warbler in North America. This is 4.5 inches long. Very tiny bird, really kind of stunning little sort of gem of a bird. It's kind of blue on top, has some white in the wing, and then it's got this lovely yellow throat and this sort of necklace of colors across the breast. It's sort of got this sort of dark green, sort of orange and yellow. Really stunning little bird. And although it's a small bird, they're quite loud. And they have a distinctive song, this sort of buzzy song that goes up the scale, brrr, and then ends with this tip. They go brrr, tip, brrrp, tip. Listen to that. So this brrrp. One more time. So on the sonogram, you can see it sort of it's going up the scale, and then it ends with this. Tip, brrrp, tip. So it's a very distinctive final note to their song. They also have these white eye arcs, so there's sort of like white above the eye and below the eye. Anyone seen Northern Parulas?
I think so.
Barbara thinks so.
I think, yeah.
Again, it's worth learning their song because that's a great way of identifying them. They're often high up, and they're very small, so if they're high up and they're hard to see very well. But if you're looking, many of these birds you're only seeing from the underside because they're above you, so you're sort of seeing the breast pattern here. But knowing the song will help you identify them as well. But yeah, the breast pattern is distinctive, and they're very, very tiny. These birds are really small. Really beautiful warbler. Okay, common yellowthroat. These are birds that are often on the ground, usually around water, kind of reedy patches, bright yellow throat, which they're named after, and then this sort of black face mask. And these will start arriving in May. Any area of sort of any ponds that have sort of vegetation around them will attract yellowthroats. These are common breeding birds, and they have a distinctive 3-part phrase that sounds like witchetty, witchetty, witchetty. Witchetty, witchetty, witchetty. Witchetty, witchetty, witchetty. So do 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 do. So a very, very easy song to recognize. And these birds aren't particularly shy, but around the edges of ponds, of sort of water courses, rivers, are good places to look for yellowthroat. Above that black, you can see they have a sort of like a frosty patch of white as well. It's a beautiful bird, and although it doesn't have warbler in the name, this is a species of warbler, common yellowthroat. Okay, this one is the yellow warbler, which is yellow. Although the males also have these red streaks on the sides of the breast, but bright yellow, black eye, and like the common yellowthroat, these birds are often found around water. These are very common breeding birds in Massachusetts, anywhere there's kind of wet habitat with vegetation around. And like the witchetty, witchetty, witchetty of the common yellowthroat, this bird also has a distinctive song, which is sometimes rendered as sweet, 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 I'm so sweet. Okay, see if you can hear that in this. Sweet, 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 I'm so sweet. Sweet, sweet, I'm so sweet. Or sweet, 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 sweeter than sweet. A very emphatic ending. So that's common yellowthroat. These birds are relatively easy to see. They like sort of perching in sort of eye height almost, like shrubs, sort of dense bushes around watery areas. So, and these ones start appearing at the end of April, and they will stay with us. These birds breed in Massachusetts. They're not going any further. Some of them will migrate further north into northern New England, but a bunch of them are not just passing through, they're actually staying here, they're breeding. Okay, the most numerous in terms of numbers of individuals is probably this one, which is the yellow-rumped warbler. It's called the yellow-rumped warbler because it has a bright yellow rump here. That's often hard to see. When I talked about, you're looking up and getting warbler neck, these birds are often high in the trees. It's hard to actually see the upper surface, the ventral surface of these birds. You can also see the yellow under the armpits here, and there's also yellow on the head, and this bright white throat. As I said, this is the most numerous, this is the most common of the warblers that come through. Often you get large numbers of these during migration. It's not a particularly attractive singer. They have a fairly sort of weak song that sort of fades out at the end. This is what they sound like. So not a particularly distinctive song, but this kind of black facial mask, white throat, and then yellow on the rump, on the head, and in the armpits is distinctive for this warbler. Anyone seen yellow-rumped warblers? Okay, well, this is one to look out for then, because there should be good numbers of these around. They're also called butterbutts because of their yellow rump or their yellow butt. So the butterbutt bird. So yellow-rumped warbler. Okay, and I think that is the last of the warblers. I'm gonna take some questions in a minute. I'm just gonna say if you have further ideas for for spring migration, having a field guide is really helpful. And one I would recommend is this Sibley Guide to Birds of the East. This is a paperback book, and like many field guides, they're sort of divided into east and west. There are very different birds on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. You can get field guides that cover the whole country, but then you're learning a lot of birds that never appear on this half of the country. So it just makes it more confusing. But Birds on the East is a more digestible book. And David Sibley is a local Massachusetts author and illustrator, fantastic field guide author. And you can get that as a paperback version. You can also get that as an app on your phone, which, unlike the book, comes with song. So you can actually play all those songs that I just played. So you can listen to those. So you can look at all those pictures that are in the field guide on your phone, although they're a bit smaller. But you can also hear the birds, which is one of the great things about sort of having bird guide apps. There's another app called Larkwire, which is a good way of learning songs. And this is a sort of game. It shows you sort of panels of different birds. You have to press the bird you think it is. It'll play the song. And it teaches you how to learn different songs. eBird is a website run by Cornell University that's a way of recording all of your sightings, so you can keep track of all the birds that you've seen. But you can also see other people's sightings. So you can go to different hotspots. You go to Horn Pond and you can see what people saw there yesterday. So you could get an idea about what you might see if you went there, or if you went to Arlington Reservoir or Plum Island. So a huge amount of data there. It's relatively easy to use. It's free. But that's if you're going to record, keep track of all the birds you've seen. That's a great way of doing it. When I was a kid birding, I would write everything with a pencil into a notebook. Nowadays, pretty much every birder uses eBird. They keep an electronic checklist, and all of that data goes to citizen science. That's all used by Cornell University and scientists to keep track of populations of birds and population dynamics. Brookline Bird Club is a local organization since 1913 that leads walks and workshops and speakers. I was the past president of the club, I should point out, so I have a slight bias. But ordinarily, in non-pandemic years, there's field trips every day throughout spring migration. They would do a Mount Auburn Cemetery walk every single morning. They are doing walks this spring, although limited participation, so smaller numbers of people. You have to pre-register for that. And then Mass Audubon obviously is a great institution locally for acquiring land and has some great wildlife refuges to visit. Okay, come out of that. And if anyone wants, I'm happy to share that presentation, so you don't have to. If anyone would like, I can send a copy of that presentation to you. So I don't know if Hillary, you're able to coordinate that, but
certainly send it to me, and I'll have Kathleen at the Jenks Center share that with everyone.
Okay, perfect. Okay, any questions about spring migration or birding in general?
I do have one.
Yeah.
My name's Jane. I grew up in Pennsylvania near a place called Middle Creek Wildlife in Lancaster, Lebanon County area. And there's a massive migration of snow geese every spring. That's truly astonishing to see. There's like 40, 50,000 birds in front of you flying around over this lake, and they're bright white. So it's like nothing I've ever seen. But do we have any of that action, if you will, here in Massachusetts?
Oh, you mean like geese?
Like snow geese like that? Because I wonder, where do they go from Lancaster? Do they?
Yeah, we're too far to the east, really, so we miss that. They're sort of they're migrating further west of us. Some of them will migrate up, like the Connecticut River. So if you're further west in the state, you might see some of them. I mean, we get small numbers of snow geese in places like Plum Island, but we don't get those huge flocks that you get in the Mid-Atlantic. So that's one thing that we don't get.
Snow geese that are lost is what we get.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Does the male and the female of the species have the same sound in the same song?
Oh, that's a very good question. So for many species, well, the prevailing view was that only male birds sang and females didn't. Okay. That's changed now. And for many species now, we now think that females do sing, not as much and maybe not as well, but they do sing. And actually, there's an interesting correlation. As you go further south, the number of female birds that sing increases. So actually, when you get down to the tropics in Central America, male and female sing roughly equally there. Okay, both of them sing, and both of them sing as well as each other. As you get further north, up to here, it's mostly the males that sing. And that's because, going back to that idea of migration, the birds that are in the tropics are there year round. They don't have to set up territories in the way that these birds that are flying up to New England, for a few months of the year, they spend most of their life in Central America. They're flying up north for a few months of the year. Those males are desperately, trying to find a new territory from last year probably, defend that, and they're the ones that are singing and putting all that effort into it. Okay, in the tropics, their pairs are using the same territory year round, year after year after year. They're not moving around creating these new territories each year, so there's less stress on that. So the male and female are just singing to strengthen their pair bond. They're not singing in the same way that birds up here are singing, where they have a very small period of time to set up and defend their territory, which is what that singing is for. The male is using that singing to tell other birds, to attract females, and also tell other males to go away. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Are hurricanes a danger to species that cross the Caribbean?
Yes, they are. It's a problem, especially like the Gulf of Mexico is a real problem, because these birds are flying for a day and a half. They're leaving the Yucatan Peninsula, and they have no idea what the weather is like on the other side of that. And because that's such a big area, that can be quite a different weather system. So they could leave in great weather, head north, and as they're flying north, suddenly hit rain. And if they're hitting rain, which, imagine what it's like for a bird in rain. It's very physical. It's very exhausting. It's already exhausting flying a day and a half over the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah. If you're flying into a headwind or you're being sort of pummeled by rain, that's really exhausting. And many birds, if it's a bad weather system, many birds will die. They'll fall into the sea and die. So the sea is just carpeted with dead birds in those types of storms. If that storm system is above the land, as soon as the birds hit the coast, they will literally just drop out of the sky. They'll be exhausted, and they'll try and feed on the first thing they can find. And that's, for birders, that's called a fallout. You can go to some places in South Texas, and there are just thousands and thousands of birds that have just finished their migration over the Gulf of Mexico, and they're exhausted. They just cannot fly any further. They've got as far as they can. As soon as they see the first bit of land that is safe for them to drop onto, they'll come down and they'll start feeding, or just stop flying so they can relax. You can find these birds walking on the ground. I mean, they're just so tame. And that's devastating for the birds. It's exciting for birders, because birders are excited by these. That's called a fallout, where you literally get these birds falling out of the sky. All the trees are just covered in these birds, lots of different species. But yeah, so weather can be a big problem. That's not true of the rest of the country, because as soon as a bird hits that in the middle of the night, they can just decide, okay, I'm just going to stop here. Okay, but once you're committed to flying over the Gulf of Mexico, there's no turning back at that point.
So is climate change really creating some dangers for these birds?
Climate change is creating problems on a number of continents. So like in Europe, you've got the same thing where birds are wintering in Africa and they're breeding in Europe. Things like swallows, which do that. And these birds are flying over the Sahara Desert. But because of climate change, the Sahara Desert is actually increasing every year. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which makes that jump just that bit much further every single year. And that's putting a strain on those types of birds. Here, we get spring starting much earlier. And it's quite erratic now in terms of when spring does start. So that confuses these birds. Remember what I said about, the males are trying to get there early enough to set up territories, but if they get there too early, if they get timing wrong, then there's no food there and they'll die. So birds have no idea when they're in South America or Central America what's going on in Arctic Canada. They can only sort of guess based on experience or their innate feelings. But as those dates are changing and spring is getting earlier, and maybe the spring is getting earlier, but some of the things that they eat aren't there then, or they miss the things that they're supposed to be eating. So that just complicates that. And because that's happening so quickly, they don't have enough time really to adapt to that.
Another question, what is the mortality rate during migration?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I would guess around sort of 10 to 20%. And it might be high. It wouldn't surprise me if it's higher than that. So some birds make mistakes. They fly the wrong way and they never get to where they're going. Some birds will die with bad weather. They won't make it across the Gulf of Mexico, for example, or they get blown out to sea. Some birds will fly into tall buildings, and that's a particular danger. And a number of cities are trying to tackle that now by turning their lights off. Birds are attracted to lights when they're flying at night. These birds, remember, these birds are migrating at night. It's dark. They're using the stars and the sun, the stars and the moon to navigate. But for some reason, if they see these skyscrapers that are all lit up, that confuses them, and they start flying towards it. And if you go to one of those places in the morning, there are dead birds on the ground because they've hit those skyscrapers. They hit wind farms. They get killed by cats. I mean, a whole bunch of things that are problems with them.
So someone wanted to know, how do you use the, is there a trick to using one of those red wooden Audubon bird calling gizmos?
I'm embarrassed to say that I don't have one. So I've never used one. So you mean the things like that, like hunters use for duck whistles, that kind of thing? What is it?
I don't know. It was Lorraine wanted to know. So I'm not sure.
I think she's going to go and get it, so we'll see. She's either going to get it or she's run away. We'll see.
Right. We have someone, let's see, what is this question? Eastern bluebird. We saw them for the first time ever on February 21st for 2 to 3 days at the suet feeder, and then they disappeared.
Yeah, so eastern bluebirds will overwinter here. So we get eastern bluebirds in the winter, and they move around in the winter. So you may only see those in the winter rather than during breeding time, depending on where you live. They will feed on suet, like a number of birds. If you want, a good way of attracting bluebirds to your feeders is to provide mealworms. They love mealworms. Mealworms are, they look like worms, but they're actually the larval stages of a beetle. So if that makes it less gross to you, I don't know. Worms and beetles are pretty, anyway. So they're actually the larval stage of a beetle. And you can buy them, you can probably even buy them on Amazon. You can buy them in a bunch of places, but certainly like in a bird watching store. Anyway, so you can buy them live or you can buy them frozen. You can put them in your freezer or your fridge and keep them. But yeah, a number of species like that, and especially bluebirds will like that. These birds that feed on insects throughout the winter. There aren't many insects around. Bluebirds will try and eat things like berries and stuff as well to supplement their diet, but they're primarily insect feeders, and so that you can increase the number of birds, this number of species that come to your yard if you provide mealworms.
Okay,
so
This is the little red thing.
Okay.
Okay.
I can't
Where
hear
did she go?
Is it quite quiet?
It's Lorraine, right? We could spotlight. Okay, she's showing us. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yes, I get it. So I don't know if there's a trick to it. It looks like you're doing the right thing. It's making squeaky noises, and if the object is to make squeaky noises, then you're doing a good job. So there is actually a sort of cheaper way of doing that, which many birders do, which is called pishing. And so birders will go psh, 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 and that does the same thing. That attracts birds. It's like the distress calls of chickadees. Chickadees will make that sort of sound, and you can attract a large number of small birds by doing that. Sometimes none of them are interested, and you just sound like an idiot in the middle of nowhere. A lot of other people around listening to this, but yeah, it's called pishing. And if you go psh, 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 or sometimes if you like suck on the back of your hand and go, the same kind of thing as I guess that device, which is making sort of squeaky sounds that birds find interesting and intriguing. So
do birds come back to the same specific areas year after year?
Yes.
Hummingbirds, do they come back to the same feeder? Is that true? Yes.
So yeah, most species will do that. They will come back to where they were born. Okay, so it may be that the hummingbirds you have in your yard this summer, hummingbirds don't live very long, maybe a couple of years. but if it's not the same hummingbird as last year, it's probably the offspring of the hummingbird you had last year. So it might be the children of the hummingbirds that you had last year. They don't go very far. That's true for most breeding birds. That they will return to the place where they were born, and that's partly to do with it's just easier for them to find that location because they're coming back to the same place. They know that area very well. There's obviously an advantage if you know where all the feeding places are and all the places where you can breed. That makes much more sense than going somewhere the other side of the country where you have no idea. You know, you're starting from scratch. So yes, they're coming back to the same place. But for many species, they also have local dialects. So they're also, when they're singing, they're sort of attracting birds in that area with the same dialect. And if you go to a different place, then those birds will think you're some kind of weirdo with this weird, like I feel sometimes, with this weird accent or dialect. And yeah, so they have issues with that. So there are these sort of regional dialects that birds have. You know, northern cardinals here sound different than northern cardinals in Atlanta, for example, or in Delaware. But yeah, but it's a lot easier for birds to return back to the same location where they were born because they know that place very well. So for some of the longer lived species, it's almost certainly the same bird that you had last year. If not, then probably birds that are related to the ones that you had last year.
So that explains why when I play on my cell phone different bird calls, they give me a strange look. It's the wrong dialect.
How do they actually remember where to come back to? It's not like they have a GPS.
Oh, that's a great question. So they don't have a GPS, but they do have a compass, and it's thought that they can see like electromagnetic lines along the Earth. So it's like when they're flying over the Earth, they can see these sort of lines, these sort of compass lines. Many birds have sort of particles of iron in the back of their eye, and it's thought that actually sort of works as some kind of compass. So they are able to. They do have some form of GPS, which is by sort of a compass system. They're also recognizing local landmarks. That helps.
Okay, so there's just two more questions. Is there a way to feed the birds and not the rodents?
I don't know. It depends where you live and what kind of setup you've got. Most setups I've seen are very good at feeding squirrels. So that's a lot of bird feeding is feeding squirrels. But yeah, if you can have these sort of baffles at the bottom of bird feeders that stop squirrels coming up, squirrels are very good at leaping from the side. So if you have a lot of space to the side, that helps. Yeah, rodents are attracted to spill. And actually, a few people sent me photos of barred owls this winter that were like sitting on their feeder or around their feeders because at night, I guess, you know, all that food that's spilled over. You may not want to know this, but you know that attracts a lot of rats. And so that in turn attracts owls to your yard.
And how can we attract mockingbirds?
Oh, that's a hard one because they're not interested in bird seed. They like fruit. They like berries and insects, worms, and stuff. So I don't know if there's a good way of attracting them to your yard by putting out bird food because they're not generally interested in that. So that's a hard one.
If you had blueberry bushes or something like that, would that attract them?
Yes, if you put natural plantings in that produce berries, especially in the fall, and especially if they produce berries all the way through the winter, then yes, native bushes that produce berries is a great way of getting not only mockingbirds but things like waxwings as well, cedar waxwings, which is a really beautiful species, but that will be attracted to berries as well.
Okay. All right.
Anything else?
I had just one question about song sparrows. On the Cape last year in an apartment, we kept seeing the same bird and we recognized his call after a while. And he seemed to be being answered by somebody else. And I think from what I read, he's defending territory. But is it reasonable to assume that that same bird will be there next year at that same spot singing the same song?
Yeah, and actually song sparrows are interesting because there's actually a wide variety of the structure of the song is very simple, or is this kind of like the structure of it is consistent across all song sparrows, but each individual one is slightly different. And actually that's a very good bird. Like if you had to ask me one bird that you could identify individual birds, it would be song sparrow. Each song sparrow sings slightly differently. It's the same structure, you can recognize it. They're similar enough that you know that they're song sparrows, but they're unique enough that you can actually tell individuals very easily. And a good way of doing that is if you just record it on your iPhone, take a video of it, and then record it, and then come back the next year and listen to see if it's the same one. You could tell it's the same bird because the song is identical. But yeah, they are recognizable as individuals by their song.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful evening.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Paying attention. So I will send the presentation to Hillary. If you're interested, let her know. And I'm happy to share my email address as well. So if you have any questions about any of this, about spring migration, about birds that you've seen, mystery birds in your yard, then please get in touch.
Thank you very
Excellent.
much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.